Welcome to the podcast, The Next Big Thing. I'm your host, Keith D. Terry, a consultant, a coach, and a serial entrepreneur. The mission here is to teach, inspire, and to motivate. Today's episode is powerful and timely because we're diving into the evolving world of communication. You heard me say it, communication. From stone carvings to smartphones, we've always found ways to share our stories faster, further, and louder. But here's the truth. Access has never been equal. Historically, the power to speak and truly be heard has been tied to privilege, like who's got the mic, who gets erased. Now, in this world where everyone is talking, we have to ask this very important question. Who's actually being listened to? Because power of communication doesn't lie in the platforms, social, TikTok and all that. It is tied to the person. Your voice, your truth, your story, that's the power. So how did we get here? Like I always do, I do a historical perspective, and I just want to do that right now. From the 1980s to 2000, what I call the mass media era, gatekeepers controlled the narrative. Still, bold voices rose up through churches, community centers, and grassroots movements. Then we shift to the 2000s to 2020, what I call the social media surge. Platforms gave everyone a mic, but equity didn't follow because algorithms rewarded outrage, the crazy. Still, consistent, authentic voices changed laws, changed lives, and was able to reach people and change their mindsets. Then we shift to what I call 2020, the future. And this is what I call the voice economy and the AI age. Technology can mimic your voice. Yes, it can. But in a sea of noise, human authenticity is now the most valuable currency. We've reached a moment where communication is less about clever words and more about the presence behind them. It's about identity, purpose, and the tone that carries your truth. So what does this all mean for the next generation of leaders? To help us unpack this, I am truly honored to have our guest here. Her name is Dr. Patreece Broadus. Let me say a few words about her. Dr. Patreece Broadus is the Assistant Professor of Communication at Missouri Baptist University with over 15 years of experience teaching topics like intercultural communication, race, and public speaking. She's held faculty roles across the South and the Midwest, including St. Louis University, and has trained both students and professionals in communication and leadership. Dr. Broadus earned her PhD from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, where she studied African American identity and culture with a focus on, check this out, call and response communication in HBCU classrooms. I want to dig into that one. She's a published scholar, seasoned speaker, and a passionate advocate for using your voice as a tool for impact. Dr. Broadus, welcome to The Next Big Thing. How are you doing?
Thank you so much, Keith. I appreciate that warm welcome and that wonderful introduction. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
Well, thank you. Okay. Well, let's get into it. But before we do, before we do that, tell the audience where do you come from? Who is
Well,
Dr. Broadus?
originally I'm a Southern gal, so I'm
Okay.
originally from Mississippi. So I'm accustomed to iced tea and lemonade and hats on a hot summer day. As a matter of fact, my husband and I just finished this morning having a nice, wonderful walk in the shady part of the
Okay.
park. And so I came home, got ready, made certain I got my little Southern girl thing going on here. So, because you always have to be a lady when you're in Southern.
There
Yeah.
you go. So you're from Mississippi. All right.
Born and
Okay.
raised in Mississippi, yes.
Well, let's get into this. You spent over 15 years teaching communication across the South and the Midwest. What inspired your passion in this field?
Here's the funny thing, Keith. I never thought I would be in higher education. I never thought I would be an educator.
Really?
And that's because both of my parents were educators. My father was a band director, college band director, and ultimately a department chair. My mother was in elementary education. And so I grew up in education. And so my whole thought was, teachers are overworked, they're underpaid. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something where I'm going to make me some money. I'm going to get a business. I'm going to have a big, huge office, on the 25th or 50th floor somewhere like in New York, etc. And obviously that was not what God had planned. So that's why I say you can make all the wonderful plans that you want to, but when God has a plan and a path for you, he's got to let you say, okay, that's cute. I'm going to let you go on your way. Now you're going to do what I need you to do.
Okay.
So I really just kind of got into education because after I finished my undergraduate degree, and it was in journalism,
Mhm.
and was still trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. So I went to graduate school, and things just kind of started opening up and started clicking for me there in terms of, okay, well, let's see where we can go with this. This is really interesting. And that's kind of how I got on that path from print journalism to speech communication and higher education.
Okay. And so as we dig into this,
Yes.
was there a moment when you realized that your voice had real influence or impact?
I tell you what, yes. And I'll tell you how I thought how that came across. Again, in graduate school,
Huh?
I was what's known as a TA. And so the TAs for the communication department had to come in and you had to have training, right? And we were
Yes.
having training in terms of how should we teach our public speaking courses. And so the graduate student who was running it for us or running that particular session for us was explaining that certain students when they would be delivering speeches,
Huh?
he gave an example in one of his classrooms. He was stating that within African American speech, he was stating that sometimes, some people will talk back while the person is delivering a speech. Because remember, again, in traditional Western value in terms of how we've been taught about speeches, you let the speaker give his or her speech, they complete, and then we
Yeah.
applaud.
Yeah. Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
he was stating that don't don't be shocked, etc. When if someone says "you go girl" or "da da da" when they're delivering the speech, he said that's just part of the pattern. And I thought that hit, something about that clicked for me in terms of why is this person trying to validate my way of speaking or the type of speech patterns that I've
Okay.
heard throughout my life,
Okay.
and why does that need validation? Why does that need don't worry about that. That's an okay. As though that's all right. That's kind of what they do. Now again, this is not talking about him negatively in any way because I knew him, we were friends, etc. And he was a really nice person, but he was just had to explain that. And it was odd to me that he had to explain it as well as to my colleague also who was going through the program with me. And we just thought, well, that's odd in terms of why does why does that need to be explained? Why does that need to be
Well, why do you what?
validated? So just that. In terms of now you'll have some students, and I think he said we get some students from, inner cities, etcetera, but he was
I
explaining
see.
that and this is what happened because he explained that this was a young black lady that was giving her speech, a young black student,
Okay.
and the young lady in the audience said, "You go, girl," while she was delivering her presentation. And he was saying, don't look at that as disruptive or count that as
Just
something negative
validation.
against
Okay.
the student. It's fine.
Okay.
That's just kind of what is done. Because
Okay.
again, in our traditional Western way of speaking, in which we've been taught, the speaker deliver his or her speech. You don't interrupt the speaker. You let them complete the presentation, and then you applaud and give your reaction at that time. But of course, in call and response, the audience responds to the speaker, etc. And he was
Boy, you're
explaining that
absolutely
that
right
was
about that. I
okay.
mean, you go to churches, you're depending on the cultural component of where you are. Boy, if people, well, I'll just say it, you're in a black audience, you're going to hear about it. It's like the
Right.
Apollo Theater, right? If you're bad, they're going to snatch you off really quick.
Exactly. Exactly. But it's a communication, it's a pattern, it's a way of relating to the audience. The speaker and the audience are both working together in this particular sense. And that's what I'm saying, what was odd to me in terms of that was normal, that was behavior, that didn't need to be explained to me. And I'm thinking, why does that need to be validated to someone else? Why does my way of speaking or the way of speaking, which I've been accustomed to and I've learned, why does that need to be validated? Why does that need to be explained? Why does that need to be given the okay? I know
Gotcha.
it's okay. Why does this group need to know that it's
Gotcha.
okay? And that's kind of what got me started into learning more about culture and intercultural communication and the role of speech patterns and then ultimately education, which is how I came across my dissertation title.
Is it fair to say that all that means your voice?
Yes, I think it refers to your voice and also the cultural understanding that your voice has to you. What does that necessarily mean to you and the significance to your community as well? Because if my voice is negated or if someone says that that's not important, then of course that's telling me that who I am, what I have to say, my experiences, my lived experiences aren't significant or are important as well, or they aren't as important as the other.
Got it. And so, I wonder what your thoughts are on what does it really mean to have a voice? And the reason that I ask that is that right now, everybody can have a platform if they want. There's TikTok, there's Facebook, there's Instagram. And, as a communication specialist, what does it mean to have a voice? Is it just me picking up the mic and talking, or do I need to have a powerful following to be really impactful? Any thoughts on that?
I think there are two different ways we can look at this. One is almost anyone can have a voice if you have the right equipment, so to speak. So
Yeah, I agree with that.
anybody can get anything said as long as you can set that up, you can have a voice. But I think what we're also getting at is the role that you hold as a speaker. When you get ready to broadcast, when you have a mic, etc., what are your ethical goals that you have as a speaker? Now, as an undergraduate, like I was telling you earlier, my undergraduate degree was in print journalism. So we were taught as journalists, this is what you do. This is not about you. You are to deliver the facts. What are the facts? The who, what, when. That was again the basics. Who, what, when. Don't diverge from that. Don't give your opinion about it. Who did this? When did it
Okay.
occur? What time did it occur? Where
Okay.
did it occur, et cetera? And that's what you do. And it's a certain way in which we were taught. I'm trying not to get to the boring journalism part in terms of how we
Yeah,
start
no, no.
with the wide lens and then we focus down to it. But that was really truly about the ethics in terms of what your job is as a journalist. So my question to individuals who do decide that they want to broadcast it, they do want to have a public voice. What is it that you intend with your voice? What is it? What is your particular goal? And at the core of it, what are your ethical reasons? What is your ethical responsibility as a speaker? And do you take that seriously?
That is very interesting that you bring ethics up, because I think some people, I'll ask if you think there is a standard definition of ethics, but that's really not where I want to go next. I wanted to
Mhm.
talk a little bit about all of that from a cultural perspective. In the United States, it's still, no matter what the White House is saying, they're trying to make America this, that, or they take this, that. There are still so many different cultures. And let's just, I guess from my perspective, uh, in what ways do cultural norms define who gets heard in the classroom, in the boardroom, and even in churches? You just mentioned the call and response.
Yes.
I'm used to that, but I'm also used to, going up and, starting from A to Z in my speech or whatever I'm going to say and taking what comes afterwards. But, I'm African American. I'm an American, I'm a Midwesterner, born in Gary, raised in Chicago, and that's who I am. And so from a cultural standpoint, I'm really curious because culture impacts so many things. What's your take on the impact of culture in voice and who gets heard?
Man, there's so many things to unpack there. So let me try. I want to go with the example that you gave that you said, that you're from the Midwest, et cetera, and you're accustomed to obviously the communication that occurs within the Black church, et cetera. Let me give you an example of how our culture impacts our way of thinking, et cetera. If I say we're talking about I want to get from you a carbonated beverage that is sweet and refreshing. Now, depending upon where you're from, is it Coke? Is it soda? Is it pop?
Yeah,
And so you see where I'm going with this in terms
dude.
of where we were raised, what communities were we brought in. That's what it is. I'm thinking pop is one thing, but no, for you it's soda, or for you it's Coke, etc. So again, our cultural upbringing, I won't even say our cultural upbringing. I just our culture is going to influence. Culture is so significant that it influences how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive others, how we perceive our environment, and ultimately our behaviors and our reactions as well. So that's kind of where the foundation is. That's why culture is important. And if we understand culture, we have to understand worldview. So I don't want to get too far off topic from where you want to go. But what we have to
No, I'm
understand
following
is
you. I'm following you. Teach the class.
But what I want to state is that culture is significant. Culture is what drives us each and every day. And culture is so deeply embedded with us that oftentimes culture is that which is hard to define. We don't really understand and the significance and the impact of our culture and ultimately our cultural identity until it's juxtaposed against another.
Okay.
So that's
Okay.
why in the example that I gave you before regarding when I was in graduate school, I didn't realize that was an aspect of my culture till that graduate student brought it up. So again, I wasn't really
Gotcha.
aware of that having cultural significance or that being culture until it was juxtaposed against another. This way of
Okay.
speaking
Tell
versus
me, tell me, tell me if you agree or disagree, or if you have a different perspective, because I want to get into, I think culture impacts style, but I think style can be learned. I don't think culture can, because I'm influenced by my mother and my father and my family and my neighborhood, and those become cultural components. And so as I think about um this whole notion of who gets heard, I think about communication styles. Is there a communication style that is more powerful than another, or is unfairly labeled more aggressive or conservative than others? And this is where I'm talking about style. What's your thoughts on
I want to
communication?
make sure that I'm understanding the question. So, in terms of communication style, you're saying in terms of the way I speak, is that going to influence how I get heard or if I get heard?
If you consider that style, I'm just saying, take Barack Obama. Barack Obama has a style, right? Take the mayor of your city and the mayor of my city, church leaders, even you as a professor, you get up every day and you have a style of speaking. I have a style of a podcast. And so I just know that in today's platform, some folks have more power, they get heard, and style matters. Does it not?
I look at it in this sense of where I'm going with that. In terms of who gets heard or whose style is listened to,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I think it comes from, again, culture in terms of knowing your audience and knowing what's going to appeal to your audience.
Okay.
And so therefore, as the speaker, what I'm going to do is I'm going to utilize that communication. I'm going to use that communication means that I feel is going to reach out most to you as my audience. So for example, if I'm speaking to a group of fifth graders or a group of elementary school students, I'm going to talk to them a specific way in which I think is going to impact them, in which I'm going to have to connect with them. Because again, as the speaker, what I need to do is connect with my audience. My audience has to see me as a credible speaker before
I
they're
see.
going to necessarily listen to my message. So I'm going to construct it in that sense. Just as if I'm going to speak to a group of lawyers or doctors or attorneys and lawyers are the same thing, or professional
Mhm.
individuals, I'm going to construct my message in a way in which I feel they're going to receive it, or at least I have to come across to them as a credible speaker. So if we're talking about style in that sense, yes, as a speaker, what I have to do is tailor my message so that my audience can best understand my message. And one of the ways in which I do that is, again, am I coming across as credible? Does my audience feel as though I've got their best interest at heart? Does my audience feel as though they can connect with me? Does my audience feel as though they are safe with me, etc.? So those are the types of things that I am going to do if I'm going to make certain, or if I'm going to try to connect with my audience and make certain that my audience gets my message, whether I'm trying to persuade them or whether I'm simply just trying to inform my audience.
Do
And
you think
so there are different modes, different culture. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, finish your thought.
There are different cultures. We have different styles because certain cultural communities have different styles of communicating. Some cultures are more boisterous than others. And I'm not talking about just American cultures. I'm just talking about cultures from all over the world. For example, sometimes Eastern cultures or Western cultures, etc. In terms of there's a more boisterous, flamboyant communication style. Others are more reserved. Others are not necessarily direct. So you can have an indirect communication style. You can have a direct communication style. In the United States, for example, in Western American culture, we have more of a direct communication style. If I have a problem with you, I'm going to tell you, look, this is my problem. I need you to do this. I need you to speed up. I need you to slow down. What's the problem here? You need to make it clear to me. And that's what we do, generally speaking,
Yeah,
in Western
yeah, we
society. But in
absolutely do
other
that.
cultural societies, if I take that approach, then that's going to be looked at negatively. It's more so I'm trying to save face in certain Eastern cultures. So we're not going to be direct with our communication, but I may be kind of talking around it because what's more important is the
Okay.
actual context, the situation, as opposed to the direct communication. That's not culturally appropriate.
Let me throw another curve in here.
Okay.
Does sex impact voice? A woman versus a man?
Wow. Yes, and I'm going to say yes simply because of what we've been taught. Remember, again, this is how
Okay,
we are
please
taught
do
from when
tell
we
Dr.
are
Broadus.
born, right? When we are born and how we are labeled, right?
Okay.
So, generally speaking, and again, this is not a stamp. Boom, all women talk this way, or boom, all men speak this way, or boom, all women communicate that. But what we have to understand is that generally speaking, there are certain styles, certain patterns, etc., that women may exhibit more so than men. Men might be more boisterous, and there's been research that's been conducted on
I
this
bet
in
they have.
terms of women, let's say, making more in terms of I believe or I hope or what I'd like to see, etc., using those types of, I don't want to say disclaimers, but using those types of terminology where men might say, I want, do this, da da da. You see what I mean? In terms of how women use certain communication patterns and men use certain communication patterns. And then if women use certain styles, communicative styles or patterns that men generally adopt, then of course women might be labeled a certain thing. Now, whether or not they accept that label or not, that could be a label that others place on those individuals or those women.
Well, you
So
know what's
yes,
interesting
men and
about
women do technically, research has found that women do use different communication styles or patterns, etc. But that's not to state that all women do this, all women do that, or all men do use
so
this way.
the reason that I asked that well, not the reason. When I look at the following female leaders, obviously I think about Kamala Harris trying to convince the American people to vote for her. I think of Nancy Pelosi. I think of the mayor of LA. I can't think of her name right now. I think of Margaret Thatcher. I think of other people. I thought these women were incredibly gifted speakers. What I think about when you said direct, I do think Americans are very direct. However, when I think about style, I love what you said about you have to picture who you're trying to speak to in order for that to be your target audience. And so when I think about, those women, do you see them having a common style or pattern or technique
Here's what I'm going to say a little bit differently because you put Margaret Thatcher in there.
on purpose?
Here's on purpose. And here's what I want to say about that. Remember again, Margaret Thatcher had a position obviously of leadership within the UK, correct?
Yes. Yes.
But the culture of the UK, remember again, she had to be accepting of her. You see what I mean?
That's what you're saying.
In terms of in that particular culture, in that particular society, yes, women could have that type of leadership. I don't know if we've necessarily gotten to that particular point in the United States. Now, I don't know. Again, I'm not from the UK. That's not my culture. I don't know what it is to be lived and embedded within that culture in terms of beliefs, in terms of leadership, in terms of who can be a leader, in terms of what they want from their leader, etc.
Okay.
So in terms of overall style, I would say from what I could see from clips, etc., that all of the women were very vocal in terms of their thoughts, in terms of beliefs, in terms of their education, in terms of their
Yes.
experience, etc. But in terms of how those women are perceived and how those women are received and how those people are looked at as credible is culturally based.
I'll agree with that. Let's move on here and let's
Okay.
talk a little bit about emerging leaders. Are there certain skills that emerging leaders should work on? They need to develop in order to be heard, trusted, and especially in this noisy world we are living in right.
In terms of just a flat out skill, I think one of the skills that we need to build upon is listening skills. I think listening is a significant aspect of communication. And I don't think we're taught very well how to listen. And this is where I'm coming from with that. For example, when you go to college or even when you're in high school, you have to take a public speaking class. So we're taught a lot how to talk, how
Yes.
to speak, but we
Yes.
aren't taught a lot how to listen. Where did you see in your college curriculum where they said, okay, you have to take this listening course? We're not
Never.
given that. Never, exactly. So I think that's a key aspect that good leaders in order to communicate well also need to be good listeners. But again, where are we taught that? And the reason why I'm going there, Keith, is because when we look at statistics, when we look at research regarding why people, let's say, leave their positions, it's not necessarily because they don't like what they do. It's because they feel as though they aren't being heard. Their managers, etc., are not creating an environment for them. So people don't leave jobs per se because, and you've probably heard this before, because
Yes, I have.
of their position and what they're doing. It's more so because of the communication that's there. So I think leaders really need to understand the role of communication and not just you've got to do this. Obviously, if you're a leader, if you're a manager, if you're an executive, obviously you need to have your employees, you need to have your teams work toward a particular goal. Well, how do you get them to work toward that particular goal? What are you communicating to them about the value that they bring to that team? Communicating to them in terms of how you respect their thought processes, you respect their expertise, etc. Or are you, some people talk about micromanaging someone over me, etc. Constantly, checking each and everything I do. Well, if you're constantly checking each and everything I do, then you're saying obviously you don't necessarily trust my work, or you don't trust my particular thought processes, etc. when it comes to this. Now, again, I'm not stating that every manager is going to say, oh, how's the kids doing, and da da da, etc. You
You
have
don't
to
mean that. Yeah.
pat anybody on the hand. But in that particular environment, in that particular communication context, what is your role as manager? What is your role as leader? How do you get the individuals to believe in your vision
Okay.
and your vision for the company, and your vision for at least maybe perhaps what your department is to achieve,
Okay.
etc.?
To recap, I'm hearing you say that emerging leaders need to become better listeners. Because at first I struggled with that, and I was going to push back a little bit.
That's all right.
I absolutely think you're right, but I also know that having led a lot of different organizations, I think a lot of people aren't necessarily clear on what they're trying to say. I think you're absolutely right. Folks need to become better listeners. Being an active listener is a hard thing to do. So I think you're right.
And listening, again, is not just to the verbal, but it's listening to the nonverbal as well.
Ooh,
Because we as people, we put so much emphasis as humans, we put a lot of emphasis on the nonverbal as well. So it's not just what is being said, but it's how it's being said. So what is that? What is that person explain to you? Because you got to be able to peel through and see, okay, is this really, and I'm going to go, let's say, use an example for a corporate person. So is this really about you not getting this particular office or this particular desk? Or is
okay.
it really the fact that so and so came in and just surpassed you in this particular position, or you were overlooked, or you felt as though someone overlooked you or didn't understand what you were trying to do, etc. So it's really about kind of unpacking what's really being said here. And if you listen enough, and again, that's why we don't understand the power of silence as well. You can kind of let people unpack. People talk when people are given that space, they'll continue to unpack. That's why sometimes all you have to do is just sit back and listen, and they'll keep telling you more. They'll keep telling you more. And I think it's imperative upon leaders to understand what their particular role is and how significant communication is. Let me give a more specific example. I didn't mean to ramble. I was speaking with someone who was corporate, and she was in customer service, and she was a manager of customer service. And this lady called in frantic because her child didn't get their shoes in time. Now, this was Christmas Eve or something like that. Child didn't get their shoes. Why are they supposed to be here? Da da da. So the parent was irate. Da 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 da. And so she kept listening and listening to what the lady was saying. So it wasn't necessarily about the shoes themselves, even though that's their product. The mother was upset because she wouldn't have anything to give to her child on Christmas Day because the shoes didn't arrive. So as the manager, the person that I'm talking about, she said, okay, I can't get you the shoes, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to immediately send you a $50 or $100 gift card, etc. And that way you can purchase something immediately so your child can have something. So it's about being able to really truly listen, see what the problem is, what the issue is, and resolve it in that sense. So again, communication plays a role in that, because if you're trying to really and truly understand the situation, understand the problem, then you've got to be able to listen. And again, listen to the problem, listen to the person. If you're there visually, what are those nonverbal cues that you are getting as well?
Okay. Well, this takes me to, let's go a little deeper. How does race, gender, and socioeconomic background impact someone's using their voice and the power of it?
Here we go. So, what we have to understand is that in each and every communicative interaction, there is power is present. Now, whether it's not always evident,
And you
however.
use the word power.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Power. And what I mean by that is whose voice gets heard, so to speak.
Okay.
That's what
Okay.
I mean by power. And what power can be both voluntary and involuntary, but also what I'm getting at is this. Like I stated, within each and every society, there are those social structures that give certain groups more power and privilege than other groups. Now, whether it's based upon race, whether it's based upon gender, whether it's based upon a religion, religious beliefs, etc., there's always a power structure there. There is always an element of power, again, in communicative interactions. Again, whether we are aware of them or not. In a classroom, for example, generally the teacher is the one that's going to have the power, correct?
Yes.
Because the teacher
Yes.
is the one who sets the schedule, the teacher is the one who sets the policies, the
Yes.
teacher is the one who grades papers, the teacher is the one who sets assignments, etc. So that would be, in a sense, power, but that's power from the social position that I hold. You see what I mean?
I
In
do.
terms of in that particular setting. Now, if we go out of that classroom setting, and let's say one of those students is a police officer, and then that faculty member gets pulled over by the student who's a police officer, who has the power in that sense? That student who is not in the role of student now, but in the role of police officer, but what at the role that they're holding in that particular position. And that's what I mean in terms of we have the roles that we hold, and then there are those other things, voluntary and involuntary positions. Voluntary in terms of those things we cannot necessarily readily change. And that goes back to my definition of power and sense. Depending upon maybe we can't generally change your race. You can't generally change your ethnicity. You can't generally change your
Sex.
gender, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Those are things that you cannot necessarily change. Then there are those voluntary positions that we have where we can change. We could change our marital status. We can change our educational status. We can change where we live, etc. So those are things that can change. So again, depending upon which voluntary or involuntary group we have, there's power. And like I stated, power is not just based upon, I think a lot of times we think it's just race and gender, but again, it's not. It depends upon also role. And again, in that society, whichever society that we're in, what
Well,
group has the social
I'll
structure? And
tell you
here's the
my
thing,
bias. I'll
what
tell you.
does that particular group, and remember again, that group that has power to a general extent determines the communication patterns of everyone else within that society.
Well, I'll tell you some of my bias. Thank you for what you just said because there's a lot of truth in it. But I do think, and I'm going to say a couple things, and you tell me where I'm wrong, because you used the word power, and I'm going to stay there for a second. And you said power is equivalent to who gets heard, right?
Yes, in terms of who holds that particular power in that social structure, in that particular
No,
society. What
okay,
is that social structure? Yes.
okay. But you said power is who gets hurt, whatever the
Yes,
context
yes.
is. I'm going to say men get heard more than women.
Okay, keep going.
I'm gonna say that the majority that well, I'm gonna say rich people get heard more than poor people.
Okay.
And it's unfair because it's not always true because the best voices are sometimes the quiet voices. And so I just think that that's kind of the bias in this country that men get heard more than women. And if people are listening to me, send me a note, react to what I'm saying. I don't believe it's true, but I think in this country, I think men get heard more than women sometimes. Well, most of the time, I think, when it comes to race, I think people aren't necessarily trying to hear minorities. When you think about the political fabric of this country coming out of Washington, if you don't have the power, and a lot of minorities don't, then they don't get heard. If you live in Chicago, Atlanta, and LA, where there's more of you and you have the power structure, yes, you can be heard. So do you agree with what I'm saying, or you think I'm off base?
I think again,
You don't have to let me off
generally
the hook.
speaking, no, I'm just trying to think. I'm saying generally speaking, because again, who has per se power, and again, we talk about privilege, etc. Generally speaking, yes, men are heard more often than women. Those who are at a higher socioeconomic status are heard more so than those who are of a lower socioeconomic status. And yes, marginalized groups are not heard as those who or those people who are in traditionally marginalized groups are not necessarily heard as often as those who are in non-traditionally marginalized groups. But what we have to also understand is that there are still resources and still elements of that even those who are traditionally not necessarily heard, they have to understand what resources are available to them in order to get their voices heard. So if we're talking generally, we're talking about the elements of privilege. And here's what privilege is. Privilege is I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to think
Mhm.
about that because that's not necessarily my concern. And so I can be both privileged and disadvantaged at the same time. Brenda Allen has a wonderful book called Difference Matters, and she discusses this particular element of privilege. And again, she goes into the fact that I can be both privileged and disadvantaged at the same time. And so that gives you an example of what I was saying previously in terms about involuntary group membership and voluntary group membership.
Okay.
Well, what type of power do I have based upon the roles that I'm either playing or the group membership that I'm holding? So, for example, I can be like I said, she gives a great example. So I'm just trying to think of a couple of examples here. In our particular society, let's just go with again Western American culture. We have those who are physically challenged, but the dominant culture is that which those who are not necessarily physically challenged, those who aren't in a wheelchair, those who may not be blind, those who are not deaf. Because again, if you and I are going to go to we go to a store or something like that.
Yeah.
We go to a
Yeah.
place
Yeah. Yeah.
and the elevator is not working. We might be frustrated with, oh, the elevator's not working, but it's not a big deal. Okay, I just got to go ahead and take the elevator. Well, if I'm in a wheelchair, now I'm in a conundrum, right?
Yes.
Because I
Well
cannot
said.
get to it. And so again, when you and I are going to the store or going any place, you and I don't have to be cognizant or have to be aware of where is the wheelchair ramp. We're just trying to find the best parking space that we can find. But you and I don't necessarily have to worry about which entrance is closest to the wheelchair ramp because that's not our lived experience. We are we are part of the privileged group in terms of buildings are really made for us. We
Yes.
don't have to be concerned about that. So we are privileged in that sense, but someone else might not be privileged in that sense. They're disadvantaged in that sense. But let's say that particular disadvantaged person has, a gazillion dollars, et cetera. Well, they are privileged in that sense because now they are economically more sound, et cetera. And they can, I can get my helicopter to put me on the top floor or whatever if I want to, for example. So that's why I'm getting in terms of we can both privilege and be privileged and disadvantaged at the same time. In the classroom, I can be privileged because I'm the instructor. I'm the one with the degree. I'm the one teaching the class. But yet I
Yes.
step outside of that classroom. I'm seen as I'm a minority woman. Then, of course, I can be disadvantaged depending upon the context, depending upon where I am, etc. Because I'm not going around well, wait a minute now. I'm kind of privileged in this sense because I do have this particular degree. I'm in this level, so we have those elements of privilege and disadvantage at the same time. So it's not necessarily just, again, race, gender, it's a variety of things as well. We are at a certain, you and I are at a certain socioeconomic level. We don't necessarily have to worry, where am I going to sleep tonight? What bridge am I going to sleep under? How am I going to get food for my family? Because we're not homeless. There are things that we're not necessarily
I
thinking of.
see your
If it
point.
gets too cold outside, we just crank up the heat. If it gets too hot outside, we crank up the air. But again, there's certain things that we don't have to worry about because, again, that particular position in society in which we, whether it's, again, do it involuntary groups or involuntary groups.
I see where you're going. Yeah. And however, I still hold a perspective on this country as it relates to emerging leaders and whether you're female and your gender and your how much wealth you have. But we're gonna move on. We're gonna move
But
on
again,
because
but that's true though, because again, what our culture, what our society believes in.
exactly,
So
exactly.
that's dealing with worldview. So if we
Well, the reason I say that and I go back to emerging. There is a push in this country to give more power. When I was coming up, I'm old enough that when you were growing up, you were male or female. Now it's different. You're male, female, you're transgender. It's a whole bunch of other things that go into it. And privilege, whether they were being heard. And so now they're being heard more. Before that, there was black or white. or Hispanic. And now there's mixed race. There's a lot of other cultural things that are coming up, and I get where you're coming from. And so I just know that, as we evolve and I focus on the emerging leaders, it is almost too late for me because I'm old enough now. I got more days behind me than I do in front of me. And that's not a bad thing. But when I think about how people use their skill sets and the culture to influence the future, I think all of what you just talked about is absolutely true. However, when I focus on, who gets heard, these emerging leaders, culture, style matters. In 20 years, we'll have a new president. In 20 years, we'll have new leaders in corporations and new businesses coming up. And do the Gen Zs have it different than the baby boomers? It's just, you are in a world of communication that is incredibly interesting, which leads me to this question. AI is going to impact all of it. Now, you might have a perspective. What's your thoughts on AI's impact in the area of communication, in the area of power that you just talked about?
Look at AI as technology.
Okay,
And so we have to look at the role of technology in communication, or how communication can impact technology and vice versa.
absolutely.
And so one of the things that I've found, and again, from my own experiences with my students, et cetera, is how something as simple as the internet and our social media have already influenced communication styles,
Okay,
how that's already influenced how we interact with one another,
okay,
and how we build relationships and how we maintain relationships. So I see AI, I'm not as astute on AI, but what I can say is that obviously, if social media has had an impact on us, I can see AI having a more impact on us in terms of our relationships and how
okay,
we perceive other individuals
okay,
as well. And let me give you an example of what I mean in terms of just even social media impacting relationships and how I
okay,
see AI going further, and this impacted me, and this threw me for a loop. I was in my classroom and I was giving an example. I was trying to give an example with my students in terms of how do we persuade individuals, right? And I was just thinking, okay, examples. If you're going to buy a car, the salesperson is using certain techniques. You're going to look good in this car. You're going to get good gas mileage. And it's
okay.
persuasive. So
Yeah,
my whole point was that we have these persuasive messages every day. They're not anything new to you. And one of the examples I also gave, or I was trying to give, is I said, for instance, guys and girls, when you try to, get hook up with somebody for the first time, hey, how you doing? Guys, what's your rap? What's the thing that you say to the young ladies? How you looking good? Threw out some of those things that you folks used to rap, back in the 80s and the 90s. Girl, you look so good, da 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 da. And as I was talking about this, I noticed my students were like aghast, and I said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "So and so, I mean, if you have a girl, don't you how do you get a girl to talk to you? Don't you say, hey, girl, you look good?" I said, "What's your rap?" or something like that. And the guys in my class just almost had to freak out, just freaked. I said, "No, we don't do that. You don't go up to someone and just talk to them." I said, "How do you not talk? If you like somebody, how do you not talk and
absolutely.
persuade someone? Hey, you need to get with me. Let's go out, etc." No, you don't do that. You ask someone what someone's Instagram is. You ask them about another person's Instagram, and you slide into their DMs, etc. And I said, "What?" And so, needless to say, and then I said, "Well, how do you hook up?" And they, "Oh no, you don't say hook up. Like don't hook up." They're like, "No, hook up is a bad term." And I said, "What?" And hook up for them was literally hook up. But in our day, it was, hey, you got the hookup. Can you hook me up with so and so? So that shows you how communication changes and
Yeah,
how our communication does not stay the same. Even my whole point was, wow, I kind of went way around the corner here. But my whole point was they're using social media to build relationships, to start relationships, to engage by sliding into someone's DM or getting into someone's Instagram account, as opposed to just walking up to someone and say, hey, I like you. Would you mind going out on a date with me? So my whole point is that obviously, if social media can impact how we negotiate relationships, how we
then
begin
AI will.
relationships, then
Yeah,
AI is going to do that some way. But I don't know. And a part of me is a little bit nervous because, again, who can manipulate AI?
Oh, yeah.
I
Oh, yeah.
how
Oh, yeah.
AI could be manipulated to say I'm this type of person when really I'm not this particular type of person, how AI could probably have negative messages about certain groups
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
people, and it doesn't necessarily have to be true, but it gets out there. So then, depending upon how much I believe in this technology, what I'm going to think about other individuals, and therefore how I'm going to perceive those people, and therefore how I'm going to interact with those people when I see them, whether it be in person or be it in a virtual
Well,
context.
no
So
doubt, no doubt AI is going to have an impact. And to me, I think it's yet to be determined. However, I'd still say humans will still be in a position to influence what you just said, the degree of their power, which is code to me for the degree of their voice. And so, I don't want to run out of time. And I thank you for giving me your wisdom so far. I just have a couple more questions if you have
sure,
time. Do you have
sure.
time? And I want to focus these last two questions on my audience, for those and well, because I don't want to say my audience, for those folks who may feel silenced, unsure, or overlooked, what are some steps that folks can take to reclaim their voice and increase their power? What do you say about that?
What I tell my students, each and every person, you have a voice. You have a story to tell. No one can take that from you. Understand that you bring something to the table because each one of us has lived experiences.
Gotcha.
And so don't let anyone tell you that your voice is not important or that your experience is not important. We all have different perspectives. We all have different life stories. Who says this one is better than the other one? It's just like in terms of our
Amen to that.
histories. It's just like in terms of our histories. If there are those histories that are hidden histories, it doesn't mean it didn't occur. It just means that was not recorded or it was not listened to. If you and I are standing on two different corners and we see a car wreck occur, I saw it from the north side, you saw it from the east side. It doesn't mean that I'd give my version and you give your version. It doesn't mean that your version is incorrect and mine is correct, or that mine is incorrect and yours is correct. It just means that we saw it from different perspectives. We had different standpoints. So again, both are equal, both are significant. It's just whose story gets heard, whose gets recorded, and why is one listened to more so than the other. And that's really, truly culturally based. Whose story is heard more so than the others.
Okay. And so any other advice you want to give them on small steps they can take or anything else?
Small steps I would say would be this. And this is for individuals who feel as though their voice isn't being heard, correct?
Yeah. Yep.
That's what you're saying. Utilize those resources that are available to you. And here's what I mean.
Okay.
In societies, when we have conflict in societies, that's when we have these various social movements that occur. Because remember, a
Yeah.
conflict is a disagreement or how we don't see eye to eye regarding resources, history, etc. So there's a conflict there, right?
Yeah.
So that's when we have social movements come up. That's when we had the women's suffrage movement. That's when we had the, Black Lives Matter. We have the civil rights movement, etc. The thing is, how do you utilize the resources that you do have? Because there are basically three things that people can do within a society. You can either, one, if you're not the dominant society, the dominant culture, etc. Remember the dominant groups that I talked about. You can either just accept the way you accept the rules, accept the system, and just simply abide by the rules in
Okay.
the system.
Okay.
Number two, you can work within the system. And then number three, you can just completely obliterate, just forget it. I'm just going to do whatever I want to do, blah, blah, blah. So that's basically and so that's what happened, for example, within, let's see,
Okay.
Alabama bus boycotts,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
The people, the African American people, Black Americans, did not have the resources to per se stop the buses, etc., in terms of not driving the buses because I don't think they even had the jobs for that. But in order to get their voice heard, they utilized the power that they did have. They couldn't change the laws because they were
Hmm.
not the lawmakers, right?
Yep.
So what did they do? They used those resources that are available to them. Well, I'm not going to ride the bus. I'm going to walk if I have to. I'm going to ride with my neighbor who might have a car, etc. And so therefore, if there's no one to ride the buses, what happened in that sense? That
Okay.
shut down the economy,
Okay.
that shut down the buses running, et cetera. So they were utilizing those particular sources that were available to them, working within kind of the system in that sense to, of course, get their voice heard. And eventually, what happened? People were able to ride the bus. They didn't have to ride in the back of the bus anymore. Didn't have to, they had more power in that sense. So that's what I'm saying in terms of a communication sense. What are those particular resources that are available to you? And again, going back to what I stated, don't buy into the fact that your voice is unimportant. Don't buy into that story because again, whose voice is heard.
Gotcha.
And again, don't buy into that because what you have is significant. Who can take away your lived experience? Who can take away your life things that you have learned?
Gotcha. So my last question is, I want you to complete this sentence. The future of voice belongs to those who.
The future of voice belongs to those who are willing to value communication. And what I mean by that is you have to have a willingness to communicate. That is, if you are not allowing the other person, if you are not at least trying, if you're not attempting to understand both yourself and the other.
Dr. Broadus, I want to thank you for being a part of the next big thing. This has been, to me, an engaging conversation because I said it was going to be powerful. It reminds me that communication isn't just about what we say. You just said about resources, about who we are, it's about culture, it's about a lot. So I want to thank you for being on the show. Thanks for listening to The Next Big Thing. I'm your host, Keith D. Terry. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support this podcast, please share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and a review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on my YouTube channel at Keith D. Terry. If you want to recommend a guest, please email me at info@terryperformancegroup.com. This has been produced by your host and Jade Productions.